The Godfather is one of the greatest movies ever made. The suits look sharp. The family loyalty feels real. The violence is balanced by quiet moments at the dinner table. Michael Corleone walks through his story with calm eyes and a careful plan. And audiences have spent over 50 years thinking that is what organized crime actually looked like in America. But the real story of the most famous gangster in American history makes The Godfather look almost gentle. There were no neat codes of honor. There was no respect between rivals. There was a man who personally beat his own friends to death at a dinner he hosted in their honor. There was a city bought with cash and bombs. There was a brain quietly rotting inside a prison cell while the world still feared him. Today, we are covering the real life of Al Capone, the boss who made The Godfather look like a watered-down version of what really happened. Section 1. The Brooklyn Boy Nobody Saw Coming. 95 Navy Street sat in a working-class corner of Brooklyn, just a few blocks from the Brooklyn Navy Yard. The building was nothing special. Italian families lived stacked on top of each other in apartments that smelled like cooking and laundry, and on most nights, you could hear ships in the distance. Inside one of those apartments, on January 17, 1899, a baby boy was born to two immigrants from a small town outside Naples, Italy. His parents named him Alphonse Gabriel Capone. Nobody who held that baby that night could have imagined what he would grow up to become. By the time he was 30, he would be one of the most feared men in America. By the time he was 33, he would be in federal prison. And by the time he was 48, he would be dead. His parents were the kind of people you would never connect to organized crime. His father, Gabriele Capone, was a barber. He had moved to America in 1893, looking for a better life, just like millions of other Italians who came through the ports during that period. His mother, Teresa, was a seamstress. She raised 9 children while her husband cut hair for a living. The Capone family was hardworking, religious, and law-abiding. They were not connected to any criminal gang in Italy or in America. They went to church. They paid their bills. They tried to give their kids a future. What makes this part of the story even more strange is what happened to Al Capone's older brother, James. James Capone left the family when he was young, changed his name to Richard Hart, moved out west to Nebraska, and eventually became a federal agent enforcing the very laws that his little brother would later break for millions of dollars. One brother became a lawman. The other brother became the most wanted criminal in America. Same parents, same house, 2 completely different lives. When Al was 11 years old, the family moved to 38 Garfield Place in Park Slope, Brooklyn. This was actually a step up for them. Gabriele's barbershop was doing well, and the new neighborhood was a little nicer. But this is also where everything started to go wrong for young Al. The new area was more mixed, with Irish families and Italian families living near each other, and street gangs were a normal part of life for boys growing up there. In school, Al was actually a promising student in his early years. Teachers said he had potential. But by the 6th grade, things began to slip. He started missing classes, his grades dropped. And then one day, when he was 14, something happened that ended his education forever. He got into a fight with a female teacher and hit her in the face. He was expelled. He never went back to school again. After leaving school, Al worked a string of small jobs around Brooklyn. He worked at a candy store. He set up pins at a bowling alley. He cut paper at a book bindery. He worked at an ammunition factory during the war years. From 1916 to 1918, he even played semi-professional baseball. None of these jobs lasted very long, and none of them paid enough to build any kind of real future. But while he was bouncing between these jobs, he was also spending his time with the wrong people. And that is what shaped the rest of his life. The first gangs he joined were small-time street gangs with names that sounded almost cartoonish. The Junior 40 Thieves, the Bowery Boys, the Brooklyn Rippers. These were not serious criminal organizations. They were groups of teenage boys who broke windows, stole small things, and got into fights. But Al was not satisfied with that level of crime for long. He moved up to the 5 Points Gang, which was based in Lower Manhattan and was one of the most dangerous gangs in New York at the time. This is where he met the man who would change his life completely. His name was Johnny Torrio. Torrio was older, smarter, and quieter than the other gangsters around him. He believed crime should be run like a business, with calm planning instead of loud violence. He saw something in young Al Capone that other people missed. He took him under his wing and started teaching him how the underworld really worked. Al started calling Torrio his mentor, and that relationship would later carry him all the way to Chicago, all the way to the top, and all the way to Alcatraz. Around the age of 18, Al started working as a bouncer at a place called the Harvard Inn in Coney Island. The Harvard Inn was a saloon and brothel run by another mobster named Frankie Yale. One night, a man named Frank Galluccio walked in with his sister Lena. Al took an interest in Lena, said something rude to her, and Frank stepped in to defend his sister's honor. Frank pulled out a knife and slashed Al across the left side of his face 3 times. Those scars never went away. They became the reason the world would later call him Scarface, a nickname Al hated so much that he reportedly threatened anyone who used it in his presence. On December 30th, 1918, just a few weeks after his 19th birthday, Al married a young Irish Catholic woman named May Coughlin. Earlier that same month, May had given birth to their son, Albert Francis Capone, who everyone called Sonny. Sonny was born with a serious ear infection that left him mostly deaf in one ear for the rest of his life. Because Al was under 21, his parents had to sign written permission for the marriage to happen. By every account, Al and May genuinely loved each other, and that marriage lasted until the day he died. But the family man at home and the gangster in the streets were already 2 different people, and the second one was about to take over completely. Because just over the horizon, in a city far from Brooklyn, an old man with a Chicago empire was about to be killed in his own restaurant. And that murder would put a 21-year-old Al Capone on the path to becoming the most powerful crime boss in American history. Section 2. The Murder That Built an Empire. In 1920, Chicago belonged to a man named James Colosimo. Everyone called him Big Jim, and some people called him Diamond Jim because he wore so many diamonds that he carried loose stones in his pockets just to play with them. Big Jim ran the city's underworld like a king. He owned around 200 places where men paid for women, plus gambling halls, and a fancy restaurant in the Loop area called Colosimo's Cafe. Famous singers performed there, politicians ate there, judges drank there. Big Jim was the most powerful gangster in Chicago, and he was making about $50,000 a month, which would be close to $1 million today. Big Jim had started small. He came to America from a small town in Italy in 1895. He swept streets. He worked as a precinct captain for 2 corrupt Chicago politicians named Bathhouse John Coughlin and Hinky Dink Kenna. He collected payoffs from criminals in the worst neighborhood in the city, an area called the Levee. Slowly, over almost 20 years, he built himself into the boss of bosses. By 1909, he was so successful that other criminals were trying to take his money by force. They sent him threatening letters demanding $50,000. He needed protection. That is when his wife Victoria suggested he bring in a relative of hers from New York, a young man named Johnny Torrio. Torrio was running a saloon in Brooklyn called the Harvard Inn. the same saloon where a teenage Al Capone would later work as a bouncer. Torrio agreed to come to Chicago. He moved into the Colosimo home. He handled the threats, and he became Big Jim's most trusted lieutenant. For about 10 years, the arrangement worked perfectly. Big Jim ran the empire, Torrio handled the dirty work, and the money kept flowing. Then, in January of 1920, the United States government did something that changed the entire country and made organized crime more profitable than anyone had ever imagined. They passed Prohibition. The new law banned the making, selling, and transporting of alcohol everywhere in America. Beer, wine, whiskey, all of it became illegal overnight. But here is the catch. People still wanted to drink, millions of them. The demand did not disappear just because the law changed. It only meant that whoever could supply the alcohol secretly was going to make an absolute fortune. Johnny Torrio understood this immediately. He went to Big Jim and told him they needed to get into the bootlegging business right away. They had the brothels, the gambling, the political protection, and the men. All they needed to do was add alcohol to the menu, and they could become richer than any criminal in American history. But Big Jim said no. He had just gotten divorced from Victoria, married a young singer named Dale Winter, and he was happy. He was rich enough. He did not want to risk losing everything by getting into a brand new illegal business that the federal government was watching closely. He told Torrio that bootlegging was off the table. That decision cost Big Jim his life. Torrio had spent 10 years building up Big Jim's empire, and he was not about to watch the biggest opportunity in criminal history pass by because his boss was getting comfortable. He needed Big Jim out of the way. But this was not a job he could do himself. He needed someone from outside Chicago, someone the local police would never connect to him. So he called his old business partner from Brooklyn, Frankie Yale, the same Frankie Yale who owned the Harvard Inn where Al Capone worked. The plan came together quickly. On May 11th, 1920, Torrio called Big Jim and told him a shipment was coming into Colosimo's cafe and that Big Jim needed to be there to receive it personally. Big Jim had been out of town. When he got the call, he made plans to meet his new wife Dale for dinner that evening, but told her he would be a little late because he had to handle this delivery first. He drove down to his own restaurant on South Wabash Avenue, walked through the door, and stepped into a trap. A gunman was waiting in the coat room. As Big Jim walked past, the gunman fired. A single bullet entered the back of Big Jim's head, just behind his right ear, and he was dead before he hit the floor. The man most people believe pulled the trigger was Frankie Yale, who had traveled from New York for this one job. The Chicago police suspected him, brought him in for questioning, but never charged him with anything. No one was ever arrested for the murder of Big Jim Colosimo. The case is officially unsolved more than 100 years later. The funeral was a spectacle. Around 5,000 people lined the streets of Chicago to watch the casket pass by. The pallbearers and honorary mourners included 3 judges, 8 aldermen, a member of Congress, a state legislator, and several ward bosses. Big Jim was buried in a silver and mahogany casket that cost $7,500. And as the crowd watched the procession, they noticed Johnny Torrio walking beside the all-powerful First Ward alderman, Hinky Dink Kenna. That image told the whole story. The old king was dead, and the new king was already in place. Within hours of the murder, Torrio took control of every business Big Jim had ever owned. The brothels, the gambling halls, the restaurant, the political connections. All of it now belonged to him. And his very first move was to do exactly what Big Jim had refused to do. He went into bootlegging. The empire was now wide open for the biggest illegal industry in American history. But Torrio could not run an operation this size by himself. He needed muscle. He needed someone he could trust completely. He needed his old friend from Brooklyn. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. He picked up the phone and called 21-year-old Al Capone. And the moment Al stepped off the train in Chicago, the city's bloody future was already written, even if the police did not know it yet. Section 3. Cicero, 1924. The day Capone stole an entire town. By 1923, Al Capone had become Johnny Torrio's right-hand man in Chicago, and the two of them were running one of the biggest bootlegging operations in the country. Money was pouring in. Politicians were on the payroll. The police looked the other way. Everything was working. Then, Chicago elected a new mayor named William Dever, and the party was suddenly over. Dever was a reformer. He hated organized crime. He told his police chief to start raiding the bootleggers, arresting the gangsters, and shutting down the speakeasies. Within months, Torrio and Capone were losing money fast. So they did something simple. They moved. Right next to Chicago is a smaller town called Cicero, Illinois. It sits just past the city limits, which means Chicago police have no power there. Cicero had its own mayor, its own police, and its own elections. Torrio and Capone decided that if they could control Cicero, they would have a safe base outside of Dever's reach. They started buying up property. They put the town's mayor, a man named Joseph Clenna, on their payroll. They opened gambling halls, speakeasies, and houses of women. Within about a year, Capone basically owned the town. Frank Capone, Al's older brother, handled the day-to-day politics. Frank was the calm, suit-wearing version of Al. People said he looked more like a businessman than a gangster. Then came April 1st, 1924, Election Day in Cicero. Mayor Clenna was up for re-election, and the Democratic Party had finally decided to put up a serious challenger. If the Democrat won, Capone would lose his protection in Cicero. He could not allow that. So he turned Election Day into a war zone. He brought in more than 200 of his men, armed them with submachine guns, sawed-off shotguns, and baseball bats, and posted them at every polling station in town. What happened that day shocked even Chicago, a city that thought it had seen everything. The night before the election, Capone's men attacked the campaign office of the Democratic candidate for town clerk, William Flaum. They beat Flaum's face bloody and threw his wife against a wall. On the morning of the election, gunmen drove up and down the streets of Cicero in cars, threatening anyone who looked like they might vote the wrong way. Voters were grabbed off the sidewalks and forced to mark their ballots in front of armed men. Some voters were beaten. A few were shot. Polling places were raided, and ballots were ripped out of people's hands. Campaign workers from both parties were attacked. A Cicero police officer was disarmed and beaten so badly he could barely stand. By the afternoon, frightened citizens were calling Chicago for help. A Cook County judge named Edmund Jurecki took emergency action. He deputized about 70 Chicago police officers as Cook County sheriffs so they could legally cross into Cicero and stop the violence. The officers dressed in plain clothes, jumped into squad cars, and drove out to the suburb. Around dusk, one of those squad cars rolled up to a polling station at the corner of Cicero Avenue and 22nd Street. Inside the station, Frank Capone, his cousin Charles Fischetti, and another gang member were standing guard. The plainclothes officers got out of their car with their guns drawn. What happened next is still debated. The police later said Frank Capone fired at them first. Witnesses on the street said the officers opened fire without warning. Either way, the result was the same. A police sergeant named Philip McGlynn shot Frank Capone multiple times, and Frank died right there on the street. He was 28 years old. Fischetti tried to run, threw down his weapon, and surrendered. The third gangster fired wildly with a gun in each hand and somehow escaped. Mayor Clenna won the election. Cicero stayed under Capone's control for decades. The takeover had worked. But Frank Capone was dead, and Al went into mourning. 3 days later, on April 4th, 1924, Al gave his brother the biggest gangster funeral the city had ever seen. The casket was silver-plated. The flowers cost $20,000, which would be close to $350,000 today. The funeral motorcade had over 150 cars. Al even bought the flowers from Dion O'Banion, who was the boss of the rival North Side gang. Out of respect for his dead brother, Al ordered every single gambling hall and speakeasy in Cicero to shut down for 2 hours during the funeral. Even the Chicago Tribune, which usually called Capone's people thugs, reported that Frank's funeral was fitting for a gentleman. Al had stolen an entire American town in a single day. He had buried his own brother to do it. And in just a few short months, the man who sold him those funeral flowers would learn the hard way that Al Capone never forgot a debt and never forgave a betrayal. Because the next big murder in Capone's story was about to happen inside that very flower shop. Section 4. The Beer Wars. O'Banion, Weiss, and the 5-year bloodbath. Chicago in the mid-1920s was not one big criminal empire. It was several gangs all trying to control different neighborhoods. Capone and Torrio ran the south side, the Jenna brothers ran the west side, and up in the north part of the city, there was a gang led by an Irish bootlegger named Dion O'Banion. The North Side gang controlled the wealthy Gold Coast neighborhood, ran their own speakeasies, and made millions selling illegal beer to nightclubs and hotels. O'Banion himself was a strange character. He went to church regularly, gave money to charity, ran a flower shop on State Street, and was also one of the most ruthless gangsters in the city. For a few years, the gangs had a peace deal. Torrio had personally arranged it. Each gang stayed in its own territory, shared profits from a few joint ventures, and avoided going to war. But by late 1924, that peace was falling apart. O'Banion was clashing with the Jenna brothers, who were Torrio and Capone's allies. He had also tricked Torrio into buying a brewery just before a police raid, which got Torrio arrested. That was the final straw. On November 10th, 1924, 3 men walked into O'Banion's flower shop on North State Street, right across from Holy Name Cathedral. The man in the middle was Frankie Yale, the same Brooklyn gangster who had likely killed Big Jim Colosimo 4 years earlier. The other 2 men were John Scalisi and Albert Anselmi, 2 Sicilian killers who worked for Capone. O'Banion smiled, walked over, and reached out to shake Yale's hand, thinking they were there to talk business. Yale grabbed his hand and held it tight. Scalise and Anselmi pulled out pistols and ended O'Banion's life right there in his own shop, surrounded by flowers. The murder of Dion O'Banion lit a fuse that would burn for the next 5 years. The North Side gang now had a new leader, a 26-year-old Polish-American named Earl Wojciechowski, who everyone called Jaime Weiss. Weiss had been O'Banion's best friend since they were teenagers. He was deeply religious, carried a rosary in his pocket along with his pistol, and went to church almost every day. He was also dying. Weiss had a serious illness that gave him brutal headaches and made him pass out, and he knew he did not have long to live. That made him the most dangerous kind of enemy. He was not afraid of dying because he was already on his way out. He had one goal left, and that was revenge. In January 1925, Weiss made his first big move. He, Bugs Moran, and another gangster named Vincent Drucci ambushed Johnny Torrio outside Torrio's home. They shot him several times and left him bleeding on the sidewalk. As Moran walked over to finish the job, his gun either jammed or ran out of bullets. The sound of an approaching laundry truck spooked the attackers, and they fled, thinking Torrio was already dead. He was not. Torrio survived. He spent weeks in the hospital, and when he got out, he made a decision that changed American history. He retired. He handed the entire operation over to his protege, the now 26-year-old Al Capone, and moved away from Chicago. Capone was now the boss. The years that followed turned Chicago into a battlefield. The Beer Wars, as the newspapers called them, lasted from roughly 1922 to 1926. According to records from law enforcement and the Mob Museum, around 315 gangsters killed each other during this period, and police killed another 160 in shootouts and raids. That is close to 500 dead bodies in 5 years in a single American city, all over who got to sell illegal alcohol. Bombs went off outside saloons. Cars were riddled with machine gun fire in broad daylight. Bodies were dumped in fields and rivers. The violence was so constant that the Chicago Tribune started keeping a running list of gangland murders, the way some papers track sports scores. Jaime Weiss kept hunting Capone the entire time. He tried to kill him more than once. Capone offered a truce. Weiss refused every time. He wanted Capone dead, and he was willing to die trying. The newspapers later wrote that Weiss was the only man Al Capone ever truly feared. And that fear was justified because Weiss was getting closer with every attempt. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. By the fall of 1926, Capone knew Weiss was coming for him with everything he had. He was right to be worried, because in September of that year, Jaime Weiss was about to launch one of the most insane attacks in the history of American organized crime. 10 cars, over 1,000 bullets, and a hotel restaurant in broad daylight. Section 5. September 20th, 1926. The Hawthorne Hotel attack. By 1926, Al Capone was living like a king in his own personal fortress. The Hawthorne Hotel sat at 4833 West 22nd Street in Cicero, the same town his men had taken over 2 years earlier. Capone occupied 2 entire floors of the place. He had installed bulletproof shutters on the windows. Armed guards stood at every entrance. Lookouts watched the streets. The mayor of Cicero answered to him. The local police answered to him. Inside that hotel, Al Capone felt safer than he did anywhere else in the world. That feeling was about to be tested in the most dramatic way possible. September 20th, 1926 was a Monday. Around 1:15 in the afternoon, Capone was sitting in the hotel restaurant having lunch. The place was busy. Waiters moved between tables. Customers were eating. Capone was relaxed, surrounded by his bodyguard, Frankie Rio, and several other men. Then they heard machine gun fire from the street. A car had just driven past the hotel with a gunman hanging off the running board, firing a Thompson submachine gun into the air. People in the restaurant ducked, plates broke, customers ran for the back door. Capone instinctively wanted to stand up and look outside to see what was happening, but Frankie Rio noticed something strange. After all that shooting, nothing in the restaurant was actually broken. No bullet holes in the walls, no shattered windows, no damage at all. Rio realized in a split second what was happening. The first car was firing blanks. It was a trick to draw Capone outside, where the real gunmen were waiting. Rio tackled his boss to the floor and held him down. A few seconds later, the real attack started. 10 cars came rolling slowly past the Hawthorne Hotel, one after the other. Inside those cars were members of the North Side Gang led by Jaime Weiss, along with Bugs Moran and Vincent Drucci. The gunmen had Thompson submachine guns and shotguns, and they emptied them into the front of the building. They aimed at the windows. They aimed at the parked cars outside. They aimed at the restaurant where they knew Capone had been sitting just minutes before. The shooting went on for what felt like an eternity. When the police later counted the damage, they estimated that more than 10 rounds had been fired into the hotel. Pretty much the entire front of the Hawthorne was destroyed. Glass was everywhere. The cars parked out front were turned into scrap metal. And yet, when the gunfire finally stopped and the smoke cleared, only one Capone bodyguard had been wounded, plus a woman sitting in a parked car who had glass splinters drive into her eye. Nobody died. Capone himself did not have a single scratch on him. Frankie Rio's quick thinking had saved his life. What happened next is one of the strangest details of the whole story. Capone tracked down the woman with the eye injury and personally paid for all of her medical care. The total bill came to around $10,000, which would be close to $200,000 in today's money. He did not have to do that. She was just a random bystander. But Capone wanted the public to see him as a man who took care of people, even people he had accidentally hurt. It was good publicity, and in his world, good publicity was worth every penny. After surviving such a massive attack, most gangsters would have wanted full-scale war. But Capone surprised everyone. He reached out to Jaime Weiss and asked for a sit-down. He wanted peace. He was willing to make territorial deals, share the bootlegging market, and stop the violence. Weiss refused. He told Capone there was no deal. The only thing he wanted was Capone dead. Weiss had now tried to kill Capone at least 3 times. He had failed every single time, but each attempt was getting bolder, and Capone realized that as long as Jaime Weiss was breathing, Al Capone was not safe anywhere in Chicago. 3 weeks later, the answer came. On October 11th, 1926, Jaime Weiss was walking back to his headquarters above the old O'Banion flower shop on State Street, right across from Holy Name Cathedral. Capone's men were waiting in a rented room across the street. As Weiss crossed the sidewalk, 2 gunmen opened fire from the second-floor window with a submachine gun and a shotgun. Weiss died on the steps of the cathedral. The bullets that missed him hit the cathedral's stone cornerstone, and the chips and damage from those bullets are still visible on the building today. The North Side gang was wounded, but not destroyed. A new leader stepped up to take Weiss's place, a man named George Bugs Moran. And the conflict that had already killed hundreds of men was about to reach its most infamous moment yet, on a freezing winter morning in 1929. Section 6. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre. It was a freezing Thursday morning in Chicago, February 14th, 1929, Valentine's Day. The temperature outside was brutal, the streets were covered in snow and ice, and the city was going about its normal business. Couples were buying flowers, restaurants were getting ready for evening reservations, and inside a brick garage at 2122 North Clark Street on the north side of Chicago, 7 men were waiting for what they thought was going to be a routine delivery of bootleg whiskey. The garage was officially registered to a company called the SMC Cartage Company, but everyone in Chicago knew it was actually a base for Bugs Moran and the North Side Gang. Moran was now the boss of what was left of Jaime Weiss's old crew. He had been hijacking Capone's liquor shipments for months, costing Capone serious money. The 2 gangs were still at war, 3 years after the Hawthorne Hotel attack. And now somebody had called Moran the day before with an offer he could not pass up. A truckload of high-quality old log cabin whiskey, hijacked from one of Capone's allies, was available for cheap. Moran had told the caller to deliver it to the Clark Street garage at 10:30 the next morning. Inside that garage on Valentine's Day morning were 6 members of Moran's gang and 1 unlucky man who had nothing to do with crime. The gang members were Frank and Pete Gusenberg, who were 2 of Moran's top enforcers and brothers. There was Adam Heyer, the man who handled the gang's finances. There was Albert Weinschenk, who ran several speakeasies and looked a lot like Bugs Moran himself. There was James Clark, Moran's brother-in-law and another shooter. And there was John May, a mechanic who fixed the gang's cars. The seventh man was the strangest one. His name was Reinhard Schwimmer. He was an optometrist, an eye doctor, who liked hanging around real gangsters because he thought it made him interesting. He had no connection to crime at all. He was just there to chat. At about 10:30 a.m., a black Cadillac that looked exactly like a Chicago police car pulled up outside. 4 men got out. 2 of them were dressed in full police uniforms. The other 2 were in long overcoats. The men inside the garage saw the uniforms through the window and assumed it was a routine raid. Police raids on bootlegger garages were so common in Chicago that the men did not even reach for their guns. They figured the cops would search the place, write up a report, take some bribe money, and leave. The 4 men walked into the garage and ordered the 7 men inside to line up against the brick wall with their hands up. They did exactly what they were told. They turned around. They faced the wall. They put their hands up. And then the 4 attackers pulled out 2 Thompson submachine guns and a shotgun, and they opened fire. The investigators later counted around 70 bullets from the Thompson submachine guns and 1 blast from the shotgun. The shooting lasted only a few seconds. 6 of the 7 men died right there. The 7th was Frank Gusenberg, and somehow, even after being hit by 14 bullets, he was still breathing when the police arrived. They rushed him to the hospital. A detective leaned over him and asked him who had shot him. Gusenberg, who would die 3 hours later, gave the most famous last words in mob history. He said nobody shot him. He refused to identify a single attacker, even with his last breath. That was the unwritten code of the streets. Bugs Moran, the man the entire attack had been designed to kill, was not in the garage. He had been running late that morning. As he walked toward the building, he looked down the street, saw the Cadillac that looked like a police car parked outside, and assumed it actually was a police raid. He turned around and walked away. He never got within 100 feet of the building. The man inside who looked like him, Albert Weinschenk, was almost certainly killed because the attackers thought they had finally gotten Moran. They had not. Within hours, every newspaper in America was running the story. Photographs of the bodies lined up against the brick wall were on every front page. The country was horrified. This was not just another gang shooting. This was an organized, military-style execution carried out by men dressed as police officers in broad daylight in the middle of one of America's biggest cities. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre, as it was instantly named, became the single most famous crime of the entire Prohibition era. The investigation went nowhere fast. Capone himself was nowhere near Chicago. He was at his mansion in Florida, surrounded by witnesses, and had been there for days. It was the perfect alibi, almost suspiciously perfect. When reporters asked Bugs Moran who was responsible, he answered with one of the most quoted lines in crime history. He said, "Only Capone kills like that." The suspects, according to historians and investigators over the years, included Machine Gun Jack McGurn, Fred Killer Burke, John Scalisi, Albert Anselmi, and a young Tony Accardo, who would later run the Chicago outfit himself. Burke became the strongest suspect 10 months later when he killed a police officer in St. Joseph, Michigan. When police searched his house, they found 2 Thompson submachine guns. A pioneer in forensic ballistics named Calvin Goddard test-fired those guns and matched them to the bullets pulled from the bodies in the garage. The guns from the massacre had been found, but Burke was never charged with the crime. None of the suspects ever were. The Street. Valentine's Day Massacre is officially unsolved to this day. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The killings were a complete tactical victory for Capone. The North Side Gang was finished as a real threat. but it was the worst thing that ever happened to his image. Up until that morning, plenty of regular Americans had viewed Capone as a kind of folk hero. After Valentine's Day, 1929, the federal government decided he had to be destroyed. And he had only made things worse for himself because just 3 months later, Al Capone was about to do something so personally violent that even the men who worked for him were terrified to be in the same room with him. Section 7. The Baseball Bat Dinner. In the spring of 1929, Al Capone had 2 of the most feared killers in America working directly for him. Their names were John Scalise and Albert Anselmi, and around Chicago they were known as the Murder Twins. They were Sicilian immigrants who had come to America under cloudy circumstances. Both men had reportedly fled Italy after committing serious crimes back home. They had started out working for the Jenna brothers and then switched over to Capone's side. By 1929, they had a reputation as the most efficient killers in Chicago. They were the men Capone sent when he wanted a job done quietly and properly. Many people believe Scalise and Anselmi were 2 of the 4 shooters at the St. Valentine's Day massacre, even though prosecutors could never prove it. Working alongside them was a third man named Joseph Hop-Toad Giunta. Giunta was the new president of an organization called the Unione Siciliana, a group that was officially a Sicilian-American social club, but was really a powerful piece of the underworld. Whoever ran the Unione Siciliana in Chicago held a huge amount of influence over the city's Italian gangsters. Giunta had taken over after the previous president had been gunned down. On paper, all 3 of these men were loyal members of Capone's organization. Behind Capone's back, they were planning to murder him. The plot had started with a man named Joe Aiello, an enemy of Capone's who had been trying to kill him for years. Aiello had put up a $50,000 bounty on Capone's life. That was an absolute fortune in 1929, more than $900,000 in today's money. Aiello reached out to Scalise and Anselmi, knowing they were 2 of the only men who actually had the skills to take Capone out, and he made them an offer. Help him kill Capone, and they would split that $50,000 payday and take over the empire afterward. Giunta, with the muscle of the Unione Siciliana behind him, would step in as the new boss. Scalise and Anselmi would become his top enforcers. The whole plan looked clean. What they did not count on was Frankie Rio. Frankie Rio was Capone's personal bodyguard, the same man who had tackled Capone to the floor during the Hawthorne Hotel attack 3 years earlier. Rio had started picking up on small signs that something was wrong. Capone refused to believe him at first. Scalise and Anselmi had been with him for years. They had killed for him over and over again. Why would they turn now? But Rio was so sure that he convinced Capone to set up a test. Capone and Rio staged a fake argument in front of Scalise and Anselmi. During the fight, Capone slapped Rio across the face. Rio stormed out of the room, pretending to be furious and humiliated. Then he waited. Within a few days, Scalise and Anselmi tracked Rio down and offered him a deal. They told him about the plot to kill Capone. They invited him to join. They told him about Aiello's money and Giunta's plan to take over the Unione Siciliana. Rio listened, agreed to think about it, and went straight back to Capone with the names and the details. The test had worked. The betrayal was real. Now Capone had a problem. Scalise and Anselmi were professional killers. They were always armed. They never let their guard down. He could not just send other men after them because they would see it coming. He had to get them somewhere they would feel safe, where they would not be expecting trouble. So, he threw them a banquet. The dinner took place on the night of May 7th, 1929.
Capone hosted it himself, supposedly to celebrate Scalise, Anselmi, and Giunta, and to thank them for their loyalty. The exact location is still debated by historians. with many pointing to the Hawthorne Hotel in Cicero. The three honored guests sat at the head table. Drinks were poured. Food was served. Capone gave a speech praising them. According to the most widely accepted account, the food was eventually cleared away, the guests relaxed, and that is when Capone reached under the table and pulled out a baseball bat. He stood up. He walked behind his three guests of honor, and he attacked them with the bat, one after the other. After he was done, his other men finished the job with their guns. Some historians have questioned the exact details of the story, pointing out that Scalise and Anselmi were too smart to drop their guard so completely. But the most respected Capone biographers, including Max Allan Collins and A. Brad Schwartz, have traced the bat story back to newspaper reports from the days right after the killings. A Capone associate named George Meyer also claimed to have personally witnessed the planning and the event itself. Whether Capone himself swung the bat or whether his men did most of the work, the basic facts are not in dispute. The three men were beaten before they were shot. The outfit deliberately spread the bat story afterward to make sure every gangster in Chicago understood exactly what happened to people who betrayed Al Capone. The bodies were dumped in their own car on a quiet road near Hammond, Indiana, just over the state line from Chicago. The car was riddled with bullets to make it look like a hit had been carried out by a rival gang. When the police found them on the morning of May 8, 1929, the coroner who examined the three men said he had never seen bodies in such bad condition in his entire career. The original theory was that Bugs Moran had taken revenge for the street. Valentine's Day Massacre. That theory fell apart within a few days when informants started telling investigators what had really happened at that dinner. The message landed exactly the way Capone wanted. No one inside the outfit would dare betray him again. But while Capone was busy proving how dangerous he was on the streets, an entirely different kind of enemy was quietly studying him. A small team of federal investigators in Washington had decided that the only way to bring Al Capone down was not with bullets or arrests for murder. It was with something far more boring and far more deadly. Tax forms. Section 8. The Empire at its peak. By the end of the 1920s, Al Capone was running the most profitable criminal empire in American history. Numbers from the time are almost hard to believe. According to estimates from the United States Attorney General's office, Capone's organization brought in around $105 million in 1926 alone. In today's money, that would be close to $1.9 billion. By 1929, his personal income was estimated at over $40 million a year, which would be around $750 million today. He was 30 years old. He had dropped out of school in the 6th grade, and he was making more money than most major corporations in America. The breakdown of where that money came from tells you everything about how the empire actually worked. About $60 million a year came from making and selling alcohol. About $25 million came from gambling halls. About $10 million came from houses of women, and another $10 million came from other rackets, like protection payments from local businesses, hijacking, and labor union schemes. By 1930, Capone controlled an estimated 6,000 speakeasies across Chicago. That is a hidden bar on practically every block in the city. Each one of those bars was paying Capone for the alcohol it served and for protection from the police. Running an operation that big required a lot of people. Capone employed around 1,000 men directly, paying out a weekly payroll of about $300,000. That works out to roughly $5.4 million per week in today's money. He had drivers, brewers, distributors, gunmen, bookkeepers, lookouts, lawyers, doctors, and political fixers. He had bodyguards who never left his side. He had hitmen on retainer. He even had a tailor in New York who made his suits, which were expensive, brightly colored, and instantly recognizable. The most expensive line item in Capone's budget was not labor, it was bribery. Capone reportedly spent around $15 million a year on bribes alone, which would be over $270 million today. At one point in the late 1920s, he was paying out around $500,000 a month just to police officers. That was money that bought him the right to operate without interference. Beat cops looked the other way. Captains tipped off his men before raids. Judges threw out cases. Prosecutors lost evidence. The entire law enforcement system in Chicago, top to bottom, had been bought. But the bribery did not stop with the police. Capone also had politicians. The biggest one was the mayor of Chicago himself, William Big Bill Thompson. Thompson had been mayor before, gotten kicked out for being too corrupt, and then come back in 1927 by running on a platform of openly opposing prohibition. He told voters that if they elected him, he would not enforce the alcohol laws. Capone reportedly gave Thompson's campaign a contribution of $250,000. Thompson won, and once he was in office, he made sure the city government left Capone alone. The level of political corruption reached a horrifying peak on April 10, 1928, in what the press called the Pineapple Primary. Pineapple was slang for hand grenades. On that day, Capone's men, led by a bomber named James Belcastro, set off explosives at polling stations across Chicago in neighborhoods where voters were expected to oppose Thompson's people. At least 15 people were killed during the bombings. A black candidate named Octavius Granady, who was running against one of Thompson's allies for the black community vote, was chased through the streets in his car by gunmen and shot dead. 4 police officers were eventually charged in his killing, along with Belcastro. Every single one of them walked free after key witnesses changed their stories. This was the everyday reality of Capone's Chicago. Bombs went off at polling stations. Candidates were murdered for running for office. The mayor was on the gangsters' payroll. The police were on the gangsters' payroll. And almost nobody in power did anything to stop it because almost everybody in power was cashing the checks. Capone himself lived like the king he believed he was. His main headquarters was the Lexington Hotel in Chicago, where he occupied the entire 4th floor and had armored doors, hidden tunnels, and machine gun nests built into the walls. He owned a 14-room mansion on Palm Island in Miami Beach, Florida, complete with a pool, a boathouse, and 2 new docks. He wore custom-tailored suits, diamond-studded belt buckles, and a custom-made hat. He drove around in a fully armored Cadillac that weighed 7 tons and had bulletproof glass an inch thick. He had a telephone bill of $39,000, which is over $700,000 in today's money, just for his phones. He also worked very hard to manage how the public saw him. He gave interviews to reporters and complained that newspapers treated him unfairly. He famously told one journalist that what he was doing was just a business. Some people called it bootlegging, he said. Some people called it racketeering. He called it a business. He attended Chicago Cubs baseball games and got cheered by the crowd while sitting in the stands a few seats away from city officials. He gave money to charity. He shook hands with strangers in restaurants. He posed for photographs with smiling waiters. To a large portion of the American public, especially during the early years of the Great Depression, Al Capone was not a villain. He was a celebrity, and his story even ended up on the desk at Harvard Business School, which today still teaches a case study about how Capone's organization functioned. His structure, his payroll, his supply chain, and his marketing were all studied as a real example of corporate management, just one that happened to be illegal and run on murder. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This was the absolute peak of his empire. He had the money, the city, the politicians, the press,
and the people. But the higher he climbed, the more attention he was attracting from one place he could not bribe. Because all the way up in Washington, the new President of the United States had decided that the time had come to bring Al Capone down, no matter what it took. Section 9. The Soup Kitchen and the Robin Hood Lie. The stock market crashed on October 29, 1929. Within weeks, the United States economy fell apart. Banks closed. Businesses shut their doors. Millions of Americans lost their jobs almost overnight. The Great Depression had begun, and Chicago was hit harder than most cities. By 1931, around 624,000 people in Chicago were out of work. That was about half of the entire city's labor force. Soup lines stretched for blocks. Children went to bed hungry. Families lost their homes. People were standing on street corners selling apples for a nickel just to eat that night. This was happening at the worst possible time for Al Capone. The St. Valentine's Day massacre had destroyed his public image earlier that same year. Newspapers across the country had branded him public enemy number one. Federal investigators were closing in on him. President Herbert Hoover had personally ordered government agents to bring Capone down. Capone needed something dramatic to win the public back to his side. So he gave them food. In mid-November 1930, a soup kitchen opened at 935 South State Street in Chicago. There was a big banner outside that read, "Free soup, coffee, and donuts for the unemployed." It was clean. It was well organized. It served 3 meals a day. Breakfast was coffee and sweet rolls. Lunch was soup and bread. Dinner was soup, coffee, and bread. Nobody had to prove they were poor. Nobody was asked any questions. Anybody who walked in got fed, and they could come back as many times as they wanted. Smiling women in white aprons served the meals. Around 2,200 people ate there every single day. For about a week, people had no idea who was paying for it. Then the Chicago Tribune ran a story revealing the truth. The mysterious benefactor behind the soup kitchen was Al Capone. The reaction was wild. Some Americans were horrified that the most famous gangster in the country was suddenly playing the role of public hero. But for the people standing in line at that kitchen, those concerns did not matter. They were starving. As the Bismarck Tribune newspaper wrote at the time, "A hungry man is just as glad to get soup and coffee from Al Capone as from anyone else." The numbers were impressive. On Thanksgiving Day in 1930, the kitchen served around 5,000 people. The plan had originally been to serve turkey, but a few days before Thanksgiving, around 1,000 turkeys were stolen from a nearby department store. Capone got nervous. He worried that if he served stolen turkeys, the police would use it as an excuse to arrest him. So he changed the menu at the last minute and served beef stew instead. By December 1931, the Chicago Tribune ran a headline saying that Capone's soup kitchen had served 120,000 meals in total. Every day, the kitchen went through 350 loaves of bread, 100 dozen rolls, 50 pounds of sugar, and 30 pounds of coffee. The daily cost was about $300. Capone himself was rarely seen at the kitchen. The reporters covering the story almost never spotted him there. But that did not stop him from getting credit. The newspapers called him a modern-day Robin Hood. People wrote letters to the editor saying he was doing more for the poor of Chicago than the United States government. Mary Borden, a writer for Harper's Magazine, captured what Capone really was when she described him as a giant who killed with one hand and fed with the other. Here is what the public did not know at the time, and what only came out years later. Capone was barely paying for any of it. The whole soup kitchen was not even Capone's original idea. It came from a politician named Daniel Saratella, who was Capone's friend and political ally. Saratella came up with the plan. Capone agreed to put his name on it. And then, instead of paying for the food out of his own pocket, Capone used the same methods he used for everything else. He extorted businesses for it. He threatened suppliers. He pressured grocery stores to donate food, knowing they could not say no to him. Proof of this came out during a 1932 trial. Daniel Saratella was on trial for conspiring with grocers to cheat customers. During that trial, evidence revealed that a load of ducks that had been donated by a chain store specifically for Christmas baskets for the poor had ended up in Capone's soup kitchen instead. Capone was running a charity that was making him look generous, and he was funding it by stealing from real charities. There was another problem. The same day that newspapers first reported on the soup kitchen, Capone's bookkeeper, a man named Fred Reese, was testifying in court that just one of Capone's gambling houses was clearing $25,000 in profit every single month. Capone was not feeding the poor because he could not afford to do it any other way. He was feeding the poor because he wanted the publicity, and he was making other people pay for it. The kitchen also had a perfect public relations location. The line to get in was so long that it often stretched past the front doors of the Chicago Police Headquarters, where Capone was officially listed as the most wanted man in the city. Hungry people getting free meals from a man the police called the most dangerous criminal in America. It was perfect theater, and the newspapers ate it up. The soup kitchen closed suddenly in April 1932. The people running it claimed that the economy was getting better and the kitchen was no longer needed. That was a lie. The number of unemployed Americans actually went up by 4 million between 1931 and 1932. The real reason it closed had nothing to do with the economy. It closed because Capone was about to be indicted on 22 counts of tax evasion, and his lawyers wanted his face out of the newspapers. He promised during his trial that he would reopen the kitchen. He never did. By that point, federal investigators had spent years quietly building a case that no amount of bribes, soup lines, or smiling press photographs could make go away. And the case they had built was about to put Al Capone behind bars for the rest of his short and miserable life. Section 10. The Fall. Tax evasion, Alcatraz, and the slow end. The man who finally took down Al Capone was not a soldier. He was not a tough Chicago detective. He was a quiet, methodical accountant from the Treasury Department named Frank J. Wilson. Wilson worked for the intelligence unit of what was then called the Bureau of Internal Revenue, the agency that later became the IRS. He sat at desks, he read ledgers, he drank a lot of coffee. And he was about to do what hundreds of cops with guns had failed to do for nearly a decade. The federal government had a problem when it came to Capone. They could not get him for any of his violent crimes. Witnesses were too scared to testify. Local police were on his payroll. Judges were bought. Bootlegging cases would have been hard to prove because Capone never personally touched the alcohol. So the government took a completely different approach. They decided to charge him with not paying his taxes. This was actually a brand new legal idea at the time. The Supreme Court had ruled in 1927 that even illegal income had to be reported on tax returns. That meant that if a gangster did not file taxes on his criminal money, he could be prosecuted by the federal government, even if they could never prove the underlying crimes. Capone had never filed a tax return in his life. None. Not a single one. He never kept a bank account in his own name. He never signed a check. He never owned property under his own name. He paid for everything in cash. On paper, Al Capone made $0 a year. In reality, he was making millions. Frank Wilson and his small team set up an office inside the Chicago Post Office building and started digging.
They went through more than 2 million documents. They tracked down receipts from department stores, jewelers, car dealers, hotels, and tailors. They found that Capone had bought custom-made shirts, diamond-studded belt buckles, gold-plated dinner sets, expensive furniture, hotel suites, a Lincoln limousine, and a mansion in Florida. They found phone bills totaling $39,000. They found evidence he had thrown a lavish party on the night of a famous boxing match. None of it could be explained by any legitimate income, because he had no legitimate income. Capone tried to scare them off. He brought 5 hitmen down from New York with orders to kill Wilson. Word leaked to the federal team. Wilson started living under round-the-clock armed guard. He kept working anyway. The breakthrough came when Wilson found 2 ledger books that had been seized in an old raid years earlier. The ledgers contained notes about payments made to a man called A. Capone. It was the first hard paper trail directly linking the boss to specific income. Combined with everything else they had found, it was finally enough. On June 5, 1931, a federal grand jury indicted Al Capone on 22 counts of tax evasion for the years 1925 through 1929. A week later, additional charges were added for conspiracy to break prohibition laws. Capone walked into court on October 6, 1931, dressed in a mustard-colored suit, smiling at the jury, completely confident he was going to walk free. He had a reason to be confident. He had paid off the jury. Multiple jurors had been bribed to vote not guilty, no matter what the evidence showed. The judge was a man named James Wilkerson, and he had been tipped off about the bribes. On the morning the trial started, Wilkerson did something that had almost never been done before in an American courtroom. He called the bailiff to the bench and ordered him to swap his entire jury panel with the jury panel from a completely different judge's courtroom. In a single moment, Capone's bribed jury was gone, replaced by 12 strangers he had never seen before. His best strategy collapsed before the trial even began. The trial lasted from October 6th to October 24th, 1931. The jury convicted Capone on 5 counts. On November 24th, Judge Wilkerson sentenced him to 11 years in federal prison, plus a fine of $50,000, plus $7,692 in court costs, plus $215,000 in back taxes. It was the harshest sentence ever given for tax evasion at that point in American history. Capone first went to a federal prison in Atlanta in May 1932. From inside that prison, he managed to keep running parts of his empire. He was allowed visitors, made phone calls, and reportedly bribed guards. The government realized Atlanta was not going to hold him. So in August 1934, they transferred him to the brand new federal prison they had just opened in San Francisco Bay. It was called Alcatraz. The whole point of Alcatraz was to be a prison where corruption could not reach. Capone was placed in cell 181. This is where his real downfall began. Years earlier, when he was a young bouncer at a Chicago saloon owned by Big Jim Colosimo, Capone had caught a serious illness called syphilis. He never got it treated. Treatments were available at the time. He just never went to a doctor about it. By the time he got to Alcatraz, the disease had been quietly destroying his brain for almost 20 years. In February 1938, prison doctors formally diagnosed him with neurosyphilis, which is what happens when the disease attacks the nervous system. He was no longer mentally fit. He spent his last year in Alcatraz confused and disoriented in the prison hospital wing. He was released on November 16, 1939, after serving 7 years, 6 months, and 15 days. He was 40 years old, and he had the mind of a child. He went to Baltimore for treatment. The famous Johns Hopkins Hospital refused to take him because of his reputation, but a hospital called Union Memorial accepted him. Capone was so grateful that he later donated 2 cherry trees to Union Memorial. Those trees still grow on the hospital's grounds today. He retired to his mansion in Palm Island, Florida. By 1946, his doctor and a psychiatrist examined him and concluded that he had the mental ability of a 12-year-old child. He spent his final years sitting by his pool, fishing in it for hours, sometimes talking to people who were not there. He had a stroke on January 21, 1947. His heart stopped on January 25, 1947. He was 48 years old. The most powerful gangster in American history died in his bed, surrounded by his wife and family, his mind almost completely gone. He was buried in Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, where his grave is still visited by tourists today. The Chicago outfit he built kept running for decades after his death, passing through the hands of men like Frank Nitti, Paul Ricca, and Tony Accardo. But Capone himself, the man who had once made $100 million a year and owned an entire city, died with almost nothing left to his name except a fading reputation and a brain that no longer remembered who he was. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the real story of Al Capone, make sure to subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.